Good evening. You would think you hadn't seen each other for a long time or something. Yeah. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Stephen Watson, and for those of you I haven't had a chance to meet, I have the privilege of being the president and CEO here at the National World War II Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for the opening of our newest special exhibit, Infamy, Pearl Harbor Remembered. So in keeping with our tradition here, I do want to start tonight by asking if we have any World War II veterans, Holocaust survivors, or homefront workers in the audience or joining us virtually. If you are a member of that greatest generation, please stand or wave, and if not, let's give them a round of applause. It's their museum, and we honor your service and sacrifice every day. I do know that we have veterans of other conflicts and some active military here with us tonight, and I would like you to please stand and be recognized for your service to our country. Thank you. Tonight we also have many important people at the museum with us, including some of our Patriot Circle and Charter members in attendance, as well as some of our young benefactors. Your support makes nights like tonight happen and have had a huge impact on the growth and success of the museum over the last 20 years. So thank you to all of our Patriot Circle members and Charter members for being here with us tonight. Thank you. I think we also, I haven't seen him tonight yet, but I think we also have one of our presidential counselors who has been involved with the museum going back to almost the very beginning. Gunter Bischoff, if you're here, part of the history department at UNO, thank you, Gunter, for all you've done and for being here in attendance this evening. And the loudest cheer of all, I'm hoping, will come from this next group. If you've visited the museum or been around here, you know how important our volunteers are to making the museum work on a daily basis. So I want to thank all of our volunteers for all you do. Yeah. See? I knew I wouldn't make it out of here without injury if I didn't. You're laughing, but you know it's true. So, and of course, nights like tonight happen thanks to our sponsors, and I want to recognize several sponsors who have helped make this exhibit possible. First, the Lockton Companies, and I think Patty Filippone is here from Houston tonight. Hey, Patty. And several members of the New Orleans office, the Union Pacific Foundation, People's Health, Jones Walker, the Alden and Margaret Laborde Foundation, former trustee and longtime supporter Alan Franco, and last, but certainly not least, Infamy Pearl Harbor Remembered was also supported in memory of Charles R. Godshaw with support of Charles's adopted daughter, Dorothy Klein. So thank you, Dorothy. We really appreciate it. And thank for all you do to support the museum. You're one of our greatest cheerleaders, and thank you to all your wonderful friends that you brought here with us tonight as well. So thanks to all of our sponsors. As I said, you're helping preserve and pass on the lessons and legacy of Pearl Harbor through this exhibit. So of course, in just a few weeks, which is hard to believe, it will be the 80th anniversary of the attack at Pearl Harbor. It's hard to believe because I was there for the 75th anniversary, and it's just remarkable to think that that was almost 5 years ago. And of course, as part of that, we will remember the 2,403 American civilians and service members who lost their lives during that attack. It was, of course, the tragic events of December 7th, 1941 that propelled America into World War II, which changed this country, certainly changed the lives of the over 16 million Americans who served our country, and and we say around here, set the stage for arguably the largest and most important story in human history, the story that we tell here every day at the National World War II Museum. So this exhibit, that's hopefully you'll have a chance to see tonight if you haven't already, examines how the attack was remembered during the war and in the decades since, and really provides new insights and encourages personal reflection on one of the most consequential events in American history. And we have a very special person who will be joining me up on the stage here in just a few seconds, and that is Tom Czekanski, the museum's senior curator and restoration manager. We'll talk a little bit about Tom towards the end of tonight's presentation. But Tom, why don't you come on up? Tom is the lead curator of Infamy, Pearl Harbor Remembered. And almost as popular as the volunteers, apparently. So, all right, well, let me come take a seat next to you, and we're going to have a little discussion here and ask Tom a few questions about Pearl Harbor and this exhibit. Okay, a shaky start. Well, Tom, welcome, and thank you for all you've done for the museum over almost 21 years, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of our segment tonight. But maybe you could start with just sharing with us what your vision was for this exhibit, and maybe a little bit about how this is different from other Pearl Harbor exhibits that we've done in the past, including the permanent installation in Arsenal of Democracy.
Well, Stephen, as you know, we cover Pearl Harbor in several locations in this museum. It's included in the Beyond All Boundaries film and also in our Arsenal of Democracy exhibit. And in those exhibits, we tend to focus on the details of the attack, what happened from minute to minute, and the aftermath of that. And for this exhibit, I was looking for something different, and December 7th is probably the date that most Americans could name. If you asked for any date from World War II, that would be it. And it's really so well remembered that I thought we should look at how it's remembered and what it still means to us today.
Beautifully said. So, of course, one of the other sort of hotly debated aspects of Pearl Harbor is how much did President Roosevelt know about the attack? Do you think he was surprised about it? Do you think he knew more than what we were led to believe?
Well, there, of course, are conspiracy theories that say Roosevelt knew Pearl Harbor would be attacked on December 7th and kept quiet. There have never been any documents found that support that or really point in that direction. I don't believe Roosevelt, certainly people were surprised by the exact date and location, but the War Department had issued a war warning order, and the War Department felt that the attack would come in the Philippines. And of course, the Philippines were attacked at almost the same time as Pearl Harbor. But given the state of diplomatic affairs, I don't believe Roosevelt should have been surprised with an attack, just perhaps surprised that it was Pearl Harbor.
Yep. So, you know, I had the chance over the last 6 months to get a peek into this exhibit, the script, some of the stories, the artifacts, the other materials. There's some really great personal stories of witnesses and survivors at Pearl Harbor in the exhibit. Is there one that perhaps stands out to you?
I think one that stands out, particularly a person who was well known at the time or after the attack and may have been forgotten today, a man named Dory Miller. The Navy had an odd habit, it seems odd to me anyway, that they had stewards or servants for the officers. And originally these were often Chinese, sometimes even Japanese, Filipinos, and the Navy saw that they might have difficulty recruiting these men if there was a war in the Pacific. And so in the mid-30s, they began to recruit African Americans. And it was the only slot that an African American could enlist for. And the African American press at the time called them floating bellhops. They were responsible for making up the officers' quarters, taking care of their uniforms, doing their laundry, serving at their mess, cooking their food. And Dory Miller joined up for one of these jobs. But he was still in the Navy, and he had a battle station, and he served on the West Virginia. Now, on the morning of the attack, when general quarters sound, he went to his battle station, and he found that the 5-inch shell magazine that he was supposed to be working in had already been destroyed by a torpedo. So he reported himself available for duty. And he was originally told to help move wounded. And after he was doing this for a little while, an officer came along and saw him, and Dory Miller was a big man. He'd played football in high school. And this officer had come down from the bridge. The captain of the West Virginia was mortally wounded, and he was on the bridge, and the bridge was filling with smoke. And so he said, "Come with me, we'll go move the captain." And they moved him up a level and had a more peaceful place for him. And then 2 other officers said, "Here, help us with this ammunition. We're going to load some machine guns. We're going to return fire." And Miller hadn't been trained on this machine gun, but he had been familiar with firearms, had gone hunting as a boy in Texas. And so after he loaded the machine guns with the officers, he saw how that was done. And there was another machine gun there, and he loaded that and began firing at Japanese planes as they attacked the West Virginia. And he's credited with shooting down 2 of those planes, and he received for his actions that day the Navy Cross. That's second only to the Medal of Honor. Now, initially, the Navy just reported that a steward had received the award, but the press cafed after him, and eventually he was named and went on a bond tour and recruiting drive for the Navy, and then later went back to war in the Pacific and was killed on the Liscum Bay when it was torpedoed and sank within just a few minutes. So an individual who's featured, and we also have managed to secure an example of the machine gun of the type that he fired that day, somebody you may not have heard of. And we also feature several other people who I hope you'll have a chance to look in the exhibit and see.
Thank you, Tom. Beautifully said. And I think what you can see right there is, I think, the essence of this museum, the privilege and responsibility that we have, 80 years later, to tell these stories. And I think you can also see how significant that is to our curators like Tom and the work that they have the privilege to be a part of every day. So thanks for sharing that, Tom. You're a wonderful storyteller. So on that note, public memory, and we talked a little bit about, how December 7th is the one day that, many people think about when they think about World War II. But when we think about the public memory surrounding the attack, I'm told that one Elvis Presley got involved to help really establish the Arizona Memorial. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about how that happened and kind of what his involvement was?
Well, certainly, and I have to thank Kim Geis for bringing this information to my attention while I was working on the exhibit. We all know Elvis Presley, but personally I was very surprised. Of course, I knew Elvis was very patriotic. He had served his country in Germany with an armored unit, but I didn't know that Elvis was involved with the Arizona Memorial. Well, he was. In 1958, Congress, in the way Congress does things, authorized a memorial to be built at the Arizona, but they didn't authorize any funds. The territory of Hawaii said, we'll get this started. The budget had been set at $500,000. Imagine getting anything built for $500,000 today. So territory of Hawaii says, $150,000, here you go, we'll get this kicked off. And a fundraising campaign began, and money started to roll in. They sold models of the Arizona. They raised about $40,000 for that. They had a television program that got things going. They raised some funds. But by 1960, they still didn't have the money and things had started to slow down. Elvis got out of the Army and his manager says, "You're headed to Hawaii to do a movie. Let's do a benefit concert." Elvis liked that, and his manager said, "No free tickets. Absolutely every dime of this goes for the memorial." So Elvis did the show. Minnie Pearl was also on the ticket. He raised $54,000, over 10% of what was needed for the memorial. Now, the other story, I was reading along on that, they were 150,000 short. Senator Daniel Inouye, who was a great friend of this museum, was the junior senator from Hawaii. He put in a bill for the remaining 150,000 and got the memorial built.
Great story. I could probably go off on a tangent here about another great institution that had a congressional mandate that didn't come with funding that ended up costing a whole lot more than $500,000. But that's a story for another day, maybe. And unfortunately, Elvis wasn't around in the early days to help us. But okay, we're going to ask some audience questions in a few minutes here, folks, so be thinking, but just a couple of more things before we do that. So as our guests tonight and over the next 7 months have a chance to tour the exhibit, what do you want people to remember and take away from it?
I think the most important thing we can remember from Pearl Harbor is that before the attack, this nation was deeply divided. Not unlike our divide today. And yet, people were able to come together after this attack and ensure victory for democracy in this country and in this world. And I hope people will remember that we all can work together.
Well, beautifully said, but before we open it up, I'm going to go off my script here a little bit. And so for those of you that don't know, Tom has been walking around these hallways for 21 years. He goes back to the very earliest days of the National D-Day Museum. I'm looking at a couple of folks in the audience who also go back to those very early days and remember Tom. But it is not an exaggeration to say that few people have done as much as Tom Czekanski to help advance this museum over the last 21 years. As you look around this pavilion, whether it is the C-47, the Higgins LCVP, the artillery, the exhibits, the collections, the train, Road to Berlin, Road to Tokyo, Tom and I could tell you some real war stories from airplane restorations that wouldn't be appropriate for a public audience, but Tom Czekanski has made a huge impact on this museum and making sure that these stories in our mission is appreciated and understood by the American public. And there will be a party to celebrate and tell stories. That's not what the purpose of tonight is, but this is the last exhibit that Tom will curate at the National World War II Museum, and he will retire early next year, and I did not want this moment to come and go without thanking and acknowledging all that you have done for the National World War II Museum, Tom. Thank you.
It has been my great honor and privilege to work here.
Thank you. Okay, well, we're going to take some questions from the audience, but we need an easy one to start with here. Give them a minute to settle down. So let's keep the difficult ones for a little later. Maggie, you have a microphone. If you have a question, please raise your hand, or if you're online, please submit one in the comments. We have one right here at the front, Maggie. Thank you.
If you could talk to a visitor, what one thing would you encourage them to look at first in that exhibit? What's your takeaway that you would want them to see and remember?
I think one of the most important pieces in the exhibit is the timeline. And appropriately, it's at the beginning of the exhibit. And as you look at the timeline, you will see that Pearl Harbor didn't just happen. It was the end result of 10 years of actions building up. And you can see those actions, and some of the actions on the timeline are presented in red. More significant, they're all significant. They wouldn't have made the timeline. But take a look at that and see how this progressed to the point of the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Another one in the front, Maggie.
So I attended a presentation by a former chairman of your board, Paul Hilliard, about the impact of oil and gas or oil on this attack. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, one of the things that is often pointed out, the Japanese attacked the battleships. They failed to attack the oil storage fields, which were right next to the battleships. And in fact, when you go to the exhibit, you'll see we have a panel that plays oral histories, of course, signature of the museum's collections. And behind it is a map of Pearl Harbor, and you can see the ships called out. And then if you look to the bottom right, you'll see the oil storage tanks. During World War II, all our ships were powered by oil. It took transports to get the oil to Hawaii. The ships had to refuel. Even if you sent tankers out to the fleet, they had to get the oil somewhere. If the Japanese had bombed those oil fields, we'd have been set back even longer than we were by the bombing of the battleships.
Great question.
Was there significant, nobody's ever talked about the damage to the city of Honolulu. Was this because there was no damage, or how significant was the attack in terms of damaging Honolulu and life in Honolulu as it went on?
There were 64 civilians killed in the attack. Some of them, unfortunately, were killed by friendly fire, anti-aircraft guns that were fired at the Japanese planes that fell in Honolulu. But overall, the city was not badly damaged. Life for the people there certainly changed as a result of the attack, but it was not particularly individually significant.
Yes, could I ask how Dory Miller was memorialized beyond the Navy Cross? If not, I can answer that same question.
He had a ship named after him just this year, I believe it is.
That's right.
And you can fill me in. I've forgotten what kind of ship it is.
An aircraft carrier, capital ship.
That is a significant honor, an aircraft carrier.
The museum you helped create is magnificently comprehensive, but if some wealthy benefactor, not me by the way, were to give you a blank check.
We have a seat for you in the front row, sir.
There you go. Were to write you a blank check, what's missing? What would you love to add before you retire?
I would love to add more exhibit space, although also more educational programming and strengthening the endowment would certainly be high on my priority.
You know, we do have a couple of openings in development if this retirement gig doesn't work out for you. So Sorry, Annette. Sorry.
Hi, I have a quick question. In the military, I was an intelligence analyst, and we always got, information, intelligence information. And I was telling my students, our students, that during Pearl Harbor, the president knew that there would be an attack, but did not know where. Do you know any more information I can share with them?
The president felt there would be an attack based on the diplomatic things, and they thought that Pearl Harbor was still too far away for the range of the Japanese. One of the most significant things I think the Japanese did from an operational security standpoint, all of the radio, the parts that made the radios transmit that were on all the ships that were coming to Pearl Harbor were removed before they left Japan. They weren't even on the ship. If the whole fleet had been sunk, nobody would have ever known about it because they didn't have a radio to talk to anybody. And since their radios couldn't be used, they left all their radio operators in Japan, and they spent the time sending false messages back and forth so that if anyone did intercept this, it would appear that the fleet was still in port.
I would also add that this is a perfect setup for something I was going to say later, but we will have on December 7th this year for the 80th anniversary a national electronic field trip that's available for schools all across the country. The information's on our website called the Path to Pearl Harbor. So that may be something you want to sign up for with your students, and that's also available on demand after the fact as well. So thank you, and thank you for your service.
Why didn't the Japanese attack the oil reserves? Surely if they were there, the Japanese knew.
I believe that the Japanese attacked the battleships particularly based on their actions at Port Arthur, which is in Korea, in China. 1904, the Japanese had used ships to sink the Russian Far East Fleet. And eventually this led to a victory of Japan, which at the time was tiny, tiny little country, against Russia, which was huge even then. And so the important thing to them were the battleships. And Yamamoto, who planned the battle, was also at Port Arthur. So based on lessons that they'd learned in the past, which the military likes to do, they felt the most important thing was the battleships and went for them.
So we do have a question from Facebook. So what one artifact from the attack is the most unique in the museum's collection?
Well, there are many pieces. We've been quite fortunate to have people donate to us. One of the most moving pieces to me that's included in this exhibit is a piece of the Arizona. I don't think there can be anything that's more significant from the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Okay, and one last question here. Since it's a volunteer, we'll allow it to happen.
Sir, I had read in one of the books that I bought at a book signing here, pre-COVID, that there are a number of huts along the coast of Hawaii that were supposedly housing fishermen, but instead were Japanese intelligence huts manned by Japanese. Do you know, is there truth to that, or do you know anything about that?
No, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that story.
Okay, well, thank you again, Tom, for the great work you did on this exhibit and your service to the museum. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. The exhibit is open. I hope you will take a few minutes, if you haven't already, to go up to the second floor here to the Joe W. and Dorothy D. Brown Foundation Special Exhibit Gallery. And for those of you that are viewing online tonight, the exhibit is open until June, so there is plenty of time to make a trip to New Orleans. I also encourage you to check out our website. Our teams here at the museum, the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, our curators, our education department have done a really great job over the last couple of months putting together a series of content leading up to the 80th anniversary of the attack. So there's really some wonderful resources available online. And as I mentioned, for those of you that have school-age children or grandchildren, friends that are teachers, the National Electronic Field Trip coming up on December 7th as well will be significant. And when we did this for the 75th anniversary, we had over 100,000 students from all across the country participating in that program live, and we certainly expect to see something similar to that this year. But thank you again for joining us. Thank you again, Tom, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you at many more in-person events in the weeks and months ahead. Have a good night. Thank you.